In the sun-soaked state of Florida, where palm trees sway gently against azure skies and dreams are built, on sandy foundations lived a woman whose story would become a testament to both human resilience and the darkest corners of family greed. Her name was Margaret Elena Castellanos, and her journey from poverty to wealth would ultimately lead to a betrayal so shocking that it would capture the attention of the entire nation. Margaret's story begins 35 years ago in 1988 when she arrived in Miami with nothing but three young sons and an unbreakable determination to survive. In America, her husband Carlos had died tragically in a construction accident back in their native Colombia. The insurance money barely covered funeral expenses, leaving Margaret with a choice that would define her destiny. She could remain in Colombia, accepting poverty as her fate, or she could chase the American dream with three hungry mouths to feed and bills mounting higher each day. Margaret chose courage over comfort, hope over resignation. She packed their few belongings and boarded a plane to Miami, carrying her sons Ricardo, 16 years old and already showing signs of ambition. Antonio, 14, was the quiet intellectual of the family, always observing, always thinking, always calculating the world around him with careful precision. And little Miguel, only 8 years old, clung to his mother's hand with a devotion that would never waver throughout his entire life, even as his older brothers grew distant and resentful as the years passed by. Margaret's first apartment in Miami was a cramped two-bedroom unit in a neighborhood where gunshots echoed through. The night and sirens provided the soundtrack to daily life. She worked three jobs simultaneously: cleaning office buildings before dawn, serving lunch at a Cuban restaurant, and studying English textbooks late into the night while her son slept on the living room couch. Her first encounter with real estate came by accident. Rather than design, Margaret had saved enough money for a small down payment on a modest house, but the real estate agent who showed her properties was impressed by her determination and work ethic. Mr. Henderson, a stern-faced broker in his 60s, offered her a position at his firm despite her limited English and complete lack of experience. The offer came with brutal conditions: commission only, no salary, no benefits, no guarantees whatsoever. Margaret would start with rental properties in less desirable neighborhoods, dealing with tenants who often couldn't pay rent and landlords who cared nothing about maintenance or basic human decency. Most people would have declined such an offer, but Margaret saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. She threw herself into real estate with the same relentless energy she had brought to everything else in her life: cold calling potential clients from phone booths, practicing English pronunciation between calls, showing modest apartments to skeptical renters who often looked down on her heavy Spanish accent and secondhand clothing. But Margaret possessed something that couldn't be taught in any classroom or learned from any textbook. She understood struggle. She recognized the look of desperation in a young couple's eyes as they searched for their first apartment. She could relate to the single mother trying to find affordable housing for her children. Her empathy became her greatest sales tool, and slowly, deal by deal, month by month, Margaret began to build a reputation in Miami's competitive real estate market. By 1992, Margaret had moved her family to a better apartment, and the boys no longer had to share a single bedroom. Ricardo was now 20, working part-time while attending community college already, showing signs of impatience with his mother's slow but steady progress. He wanted success faster, wealth sooner, recognition immediately. Antonio, 18, was more patient but equally ambitious, studying business administration and watching his mother's career with analytical interest. Miguel, 12 years old, remained the family cheerleader, proud of every small victory his mother achieved. When she closed her first major sale, earning a commission that allowed them to buy their first car, Miguel celebrated as if she had won the lottery. When she was featured in a local Spanish language newspaper as an up-and-coming real estate professional, Miguel cut out the article and proudly showed it to his teachers and classmates at school. Margaret's breakthrough came in 1995 when she specialized in commercial properties rather than residential sales. She realized that businesses needed space more urgently than individuals needed homes, and they were often willing to pay premium prices for the right location. Her first commercial deal was a small office building in Hialeah, but it opened doors to larger opportunities and more substantial commissions. By 1998, Margaret had saved enough money to make her first property purchase as an investor rather than just a broker. She bought a modest strip mall in Hialeah, a collection of small shops, and restaurants that generated steady rental income. Standing before that first plaza with her three sons, now young men, Margaret felt a pride that went beyond financial success. This was her first piece of America that nobody could take away. Ricardo, 26 years old, looked at the plaza with calculating eyes, already wondering about its value and potential for growth. Antonio, 24, admired his mother's business acumen but remained focused on his own career in banking. Miguel, 18 and about, to start college, simply beamed with pride at his mother's achievement, seeing it as proof of her incredible strength and determination rather than a stepping stone to personal wealth. The next decade would transform Margaret from a successful real estate broker into a commercial property mogul. She purchased plaza after plaza, each one larger and more valuable than the last. By 2005, she owned 8 commercial properties across Miami-Dade County. By 2010, that number had grown to 12, and her net worth exceeded $20 million. Margaret Castellanos had achieved the American dream through sheer force of will and uncompromising work ethic. But success, as Margaret would learn too late, can poison family relationships just as surely as failure can destroy them. As her wealth grew, so did the resentment of her 2 older sons. Ricardo, now in his 30s, had become a middle manager at a telecommunications company. His salary was comfortable but modest compared to his mother's growing fortune. He began to feel that his mother's success somehow diminished his own accomplishments. Antonio had found success as a loan officer at a major bank, but he too felt overshadowed by his mother's empire. Both brothers had watched their childhood friends inherit family businesses or receive substantial gifts from wealthy parents while their own mother continued to work 16-hour days accumulating wealth, but rarely sharing it with her adult sons. Miguel, the youngest, had followed a different path entirely. After graduating from college with a degree in computer science, he had started his own small software company. His business was successful enough to provide a comfortable living, but more importantly, Miguel had never measured his worth by comparing himself to his mother's achievements. He visited Margaret daily, bringing groceries, fixing things around her house, and genuinely caring about her well-being rather than her wealth. By 2015, Margaret was 72 years old, and the decades of 18-hour workdays had taken their toll on her health. During a routine medical examination, Dr. Rodriguez, her cardiologist, delivered devastating news. Margaret's heart condition was serious, potentially fatal. Another major cardiac event could kill her without warning. She might have months, possibly years, but she needed to prepare for the possibility of sudden death. Margaret received this diagnosis with the same calm determination she had brought to every other challenge in her life. She had faced poverty, widowhood, immigration, and discrimination. Now she would face mortality with equal courage. But first, she needed to make crucial decisions about her family's financial future. The question of inheritance had been weighing on Margaret's mind for several years. She had watched her 2 older sons develop what she considered unhealthy attitudes toward money. Ricardo had developed a gambling problem that he thought nobody knew about, but Margaret had noticed the signs: frequent trips to casinos, mysterious financial difficulties, despite his steady salary and a growing obsession with get-rich-quick schemes. Antonio had his own financial problems. Despite earning a good income as a bank loan officer, he spent money faster than he could earn it. His credit cards were maxed out constantly, and he had borrowed money from friends and extended family members more times than Margaret could count. She worried that a large inheritance would only enable his poor financial decision-making. Miguel, on the other hand, lived modestly despite his business success. He had never asked his mother for financial help, even when his software company was struggling in its early years. He saved money carefully, invested wisely, and had already begun planning for his own children's college educations, even though he wasn't yet married. After consulting with her attorney and financial advisors, Margaret made a decision that she hoped would protect her family's wealth for future generations. She would distribute her properties while she was still alive, giving Ricardo and Antonio each property's worth approximately $10 million, while Miguel would receive the crown jewel of her empire, the Aventura Plaza, valued at $20 million. Margaret called her three sons together for dinner at her Coral Gables mansion on a warm evening in March 2015. The dining room was elegantly appointed with antique furniture and family photos, spanning 3 decades. Margaret had prepared her sons' favorite Cuban dishes, creating an atmosphere of celebration that she hoped would soften the impact of her inheritance announcement. When Margaret revealed her inheritance plan, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Ricardo's face darkened with barely contained rage. How could his mother give Miguel twice as much as her other sons? What had Miguel done to deserve such favoritism? Antonio, usually the peacemaker, found himself agreeing with his older brother's outrage. The inheritance distribution seemed fundamentally unfair, a betrayal of their equal status as sons. Miguel, uncomfortable with the attention and aware of his brother's growing anger, tried to suggest that the inheritance should be divided equally among all 3 sons. But Margaret was firm in her decision. She had consulted extensively with attorneys and financial advisors. The distribution reflected not favoritism, but responsibility and wisdom. Ricardo and Antonio would squander their inheritance within 5 years. Miguel would preserve it for future generations. As the evening ended, Ricardo and Antonio left, their mother's house burning with resentment. In the driveway, under the cover of darkness, they spoke, in hushed but heated tones, about their mother's betrayal. How could she treat them like second-class citizens in their own family? Miguel had always been her favorite, but this inheritance decision was the ultimate insult to their status as sons. Over the following weeks, the brothers' anger festered and grew. They met regularly at a dimly lit bar in downtown Miami, drinking too much and feeding each other's rage with increasingly bitter complaints about their mother's favoritism. Ricardo was the more aggressive of the two, convinced that they needed to confront Margaret directly and demand equal treatment. Antonio, usually more cautious, found himself swept up in his brother's fury. They began to rationalize increasingly extreme solutions to their inheritance problem. What if Margaret had an accident? What if she changed her mind under pressure? What if they could convince her that Miguel didn't deserve such a large portion of the family wealth? Their conversations grew darker, with each meeting moving from complaints to conspiracy. Meanwhile, Miguel continued his daily visits to his mother's house, unaware of his brother's growing resentment. He brought groceries, prepared meals, maintained the garden, and provided the companionship that Margaret cherished more than any material possession. Margaret's health was declining, slowly but steadily, and Miguel's presence brought her comfort during a frightening and uncertain time. Margaret's beloved cat, Princess, a beautiful Persian with striking blue eyes, had become increasingly important to her as her health declined. Miguel, ever thoughtful, had installed an automatic feeding system connected to a small camera so Margaret could monitor Princess's eating habits and general health even when she wasn't at home. The device was discreetly placed in the corner of Margaret's study, virtually invisible, unless someone knew exactly where to look. The camera had been Miguel's idea, born from his concern about his mother's tendency to worry about Princess when she was away from the house. Margaret could now check her phone and see that Princess was eating properly and behaving Normally, it was a small gesture of love, the kind of thoughtful consideration that had always characterized Miguel's relationship with his mother. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a humid evening in June 2015. Margaret was, in her study, reviewing financial documents and playing with Princess when she heard the front door open. She expected Miguel, who usually arrived around, this time with groceries or simply to check on her well-being. Instead, she heard the angry voices of Ricardo and Antonio echoing through the mansion's marble hallways. The brothers had been drinking at their usual bar, working themselves into a fury about their mother's inheritance decision. Tonight, they had decided, would be the night they demanded justice. They would confront Margaret face to face and force her to change the inheritance distribution to give them equal shares of the family wealth. Margaret looked up from her desk as her two older sons burst into her study. Their faces were flushed with alcohol and anger. Their voices raised in accusations and demands. Why had she betrayed them? How could she favor Miguel over her other sons? What gave her the right to decide that they were less worthy of their father's legacy than their younger brother? Margaret tried to maintain her composure, explaining once again the reasoning behind her inheritance decision. Ricardo and Antonio were not being punished, she insisted. They were receiving substantial inheritances that would secure their family's financial futures. But she had to consider who would be most responsible with the family wealth, who would preserve it for future generations rather than squander it on poor investments or gambling debts. The mention of Ricardo's gambling problem was the spark that ignited the explosion. How dare she judge his personal choices? How dare she act as if she knew what was best for grown men with families of their own? The argument escalated beyond rational discussion into a screaming match that echoed through the mansion's empty rooms. Margaret's frail voice was no match for her son's alcohol-fueled rage. Princess, sensing the tension and frightened by the raised voices, hid under Margaret's desk, her blue eyes wide with fear. The automatic feeder's camera continued its silent recording, capturing every moment of the family's disintegration with digital precision. The moment that would haunt Ricardo and Antonio for the rest of their lives happened in an instant. Margaret, trying to calm her sons, reached out to touch Ricardo's arm in a gesture of maternal comfort. But Ricardo, lost in his fury, jerked away from her touch with such violence that Margaret lost her balance. At 72 years old, with a serious heart condition and brittle bones, Margaret was no match for the force of Ricardo's movement. She fell backward, striking her head against the sharp corner of her mahogany desk with a sickening crack that silenced the room immediately. Margaret gasped, once her eyes wide with shock and pain, and then lay still on the Persian rug. The silence that followed was deafening. Ricardo and Antonio stared at their mother's motionless body there, anger instantly replaced by horror and disbelief. They had come to argue about money, to demand their rightful inheritance. They had never intended violence. They had certainly never intended to kill the woman who had sacrificed everything to build their family's wealth and secure their futures. But Margaret Elena Castellanos, the woman who had survived poverty, widowhood, and discrimination, who had built a $20 million empire through sheer determination and endless hard work, was dead. Her heart, already weakened by decades of stress and recent illness, had stopped beating. Her sons, blinded by greed and resentment, had destroyed the very source of the wealth they coveted so desperately. Panic replaced shock as the brothers realized the magnitude of their situation. They were in their mother's house, alone with her body, with no witnesses to explain what had happened. Who would believe that her death had been an accident? Who would believe that they had come to talk, not to commit murder? Ricardo, always the leader in their relationship, took charge of the situation with the same ruthless determination his mother had once shown in business. They would dispose of the body, he decided. They would create alibis for themselves. They would claim that they had been at home all evening, watching television or spending time with their families. Without a body, there could be no murder investigation. Antonio, horrified but trapped by his complicity, helped. His brother carried their mother's body from the study. They wrapped Margaret in blankets and loaded her into Ricardo's truck, driving to a remote area of the Everglades where countless secrets had been buried over the years. By dawn, Margaret Castellanos had disappeared without a trace, and her two older sons had returned to their respective homes to establish their alibis, but they had forgotten about the camera. Miguel arrived at his mother's house the next morning carrying fresh oysters from the local fish market, Margaret's favorite delicacy that he brought her every few weeks. He had tried calling her the night before, but received no answer, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Margaret sometimes went to bed early when she was feeling tired or unwell. When Miguel found the house empty, with no one, sign of his mother anywhere, he initially assumed she had gone out early for a medical appointment or business meeting. But as hours passed, with no word from Margaret, Miguel's concern grew into genuine fear. Margaret never left town without telling him. She never went anywhere without ensuring that someone was available to care for Princess. Miguel called Ricardo and Antonio, who expressed surprise and concern about their mother's disappearance. They claimed to have been at home the previous evening, watching television with their families. They suggested that Margaret might have had a medical emergency or decided to take an impromptu trip somewhere, but their explanations rang hollow to Miguel, who knew his mother's habits and personality better than anyone. When Margaret didn't return home that evening, Miguel called the police. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran investigator with the Miami-Dade Police Department, took the missing person report and began a preliminary investigation. Margaret's car was still in her driveway. Her person identification were still in her bedroom. Princess was hungry and distressed, clearly having been alone for many hours. The investigation progressed slowly, hampered by lack of physical evidence and credible witnesses. Ricardo and Antonio maintained their alibis, claiming to have been at their respective homes all evening. Their wives corroborated their stories, though Detective Martinez noted some inconsistencies in the timing of their accounts. But inconsistencies weren't evidence, and without a body or a clear motive, the case stalled. Weeks passed with no leads and no progress. Margaret Castellanos, one of Miami's most successful businesswomen, had simply vanished without a trace. The local media covered the story briefly, but without new developments. Public interest waned. Detective Martinez continued working the case, but she had little to go on besides suspicions and circumstantial evidence. Miguel, devastated by his mother's disappearance, spent hours at her house, hoping for some clue about what had happened to her. He fed Princess, maintained the garden, and kept the house exactly as Margaret had left it. The automatic feeder continued working perfectly, and Miguel occasionally checked his phone to see Princess eating or sleeping in the study where Margaret had spent so many hours building her empire. It was during one of these routine checks that Miguel noticed something unusual in the camera footage. The device stored several days' worth of recordings, and Miguel had never bothered to review the older files, but something prompted him to scroll back to the night of Margaret's disappearance, the night that had changed his life forever. What Miguel saw on that small screen would haunt him for the rest of his life. The camera had captured everything. His brothers arriving at the house, their voices raised in anger. Margaret trying to calm them, reaching out in a gesture of maternal love. Ricardo's violent reaction, Margaret's fall, the sickening crack of her head against the desk corner, the silence that followed. Miguel watched in horror as his brothers checked. Their mother's pulse confirmed that she was dead, and then began planning the disposal of her body. He watched them wrap Margaret in blankets and carry her from the room. He watched them return hours later to clean up evidence and establish their alibis. The truth about his mother's death was more devastating than Miguel could have imagined. Margaret hadn't died peacefully in her sleep or suffered a sudden heart attack. She had been killed by her own sons, the children she had sacrificed, everything to raise and support. Their greed and resentment had destroyed the very woman who had created the wealth they coveted so desperately. Miguel's first instinct was to confront his brothers directly, to demand an explanation for their horrific crime. But his grief quickly hardened into determination. His mother deserved justice, not just answers. Ricardo and Antonio had murdered Margaret and then lied about it for weeks, allowing Miguel to suffer through the agony of not knowing what had happened to her. With trembling hands, Miguel copied the video files to a secure drive and called Detective Martinez. Within hours, the Miami-Dade Police Department had arrest warrants for Ricardo and Antonio Castellanos. The video evidence was clear and undeniable. Margaret's death had not been natural or accidental. Her own sons had killed her in a fit of rage over money and inheritance. The arrest made headlines across South Florida. The story of the millionaire widow murdered by her own sons captured public attention and sparked countless discussions about greed, family loyalty, and the corrupting power of wealth. Ricardo and Antonio were charged with manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, as the video evidence suggested that Margaret's death had been the result of a confrontation that escalated beyond their original intentions. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Miguel testified with quiet dignity about his mother's life, her struggles, and her achievements. He described the inheritance plan that had triggered his brothers' fatal rage, explaining Margaret's reasoning and her hopes for preserving the family wealth for future generations. The defense attorneys argued that Ricardo and Antonio had never intended to hurt their mother, that her death had been a tragic accident during a heated argument about family finances. But the video evidence was damning. Jurors could see the violence in Ricardo's movement, the force with which he had pushed away from Margaret's gentle touch. The prosecution painted a picture of two greedy sons who had murdered their mother for money, then callously disposed of her body and lied to police and family members for weeks. The contrast with Miguel's devotion to Margaret only made their crimes seem more heinous and unforgivable. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found both brothers guilty of manslaughter. Ricardo received a sentence of 22 years in prison. Antonio, deemed slightly less culpable due to his secondary role in the confrontation, received 18 years. Both men would spend the prime years of their adult lives behind bars, paying for their moment of deadly greed and violence. The discovery of Margaret's body in the Everglades allowed for a proper funeral, giving Miguel and the broader community a chance to mourn and celebrate her remarkable life. Hundreds of people attended the service, from business associates and employees to tenants and neighbors who had been touched by Margaret's generosity and determination. Miguel inherited his mother's entire estate as his brother's criminal convictions invalidated their inheritance rights under Florida law. But the wealth that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a burden. Every plaza, every property, every dollar reminded Miguel of the price his family had paid for financial success. He established the Margaret Castellanos Foundation, dedicating much of his inheritance to helping immigrant women start businesses and achieve financial independence. The foundation provided microloans, business mentoring, and educational scholarships, carrying forward Margaret's legacy of hard work and determination while honoring her memory in a meaningful way. Miguel also kept Princess, his mother's beloved cat, who became a living reminder of Margaret's capacity for love and the small gestures of kindness. That had meant more to her than all her commercial success combined. The automatic feeder that had captured his brother's crime was retired, but Miguel never forgot how a simple act of love and technology had ultimately delivered justice for his mother. The story of Margaret Castellanos became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked greed and the importance of family loyalty. Her rise from poverty to wealth inspired countless immigrants and entrepreneurs, while her tragic death served as a reminder. That success means nothing without the love and respect of those closest to us. In the end, Margaret's dream of preserving her wealth for future generations was realized, though not in the way she had planned. Miguel's children would inherit not just financial resources, but also the story of their grandmother's courage, determination, and ultimate sacrifice. They would learn that true wealth comes not from accumulating money, but from building relationships based on love, respect, and genuine care for one another's well-being. The Florida millionaire widow's legacy lives on in the foundation that bears her name, in the lessons her story teaches about family and greed, and in the memory of a woman who refused to let poverty, discrimination, or tragedy defeat her dreams. Margaret Elena Castellanos had achieved the American dream through her own efforts, and even in death, her spirit of determination and justice continued to inspire others to build better lives for themselves and their families. Justice had been served, but the price was higher than anyone could have imagined. Two sons lost to prison, a mother lost to violence, and a family destroyed by the very wealth that was supposed to secure their happiness forever. It was a tragedy that could have been avoided with love, communication, and the simple recognition that family bonds are more valuable than any material possession or financial inheritance in this world.